And what I said on Wednesday's show was, Wednesday night, we get a fun slate of games that I promise we will look at on Friday's show. We'll recap them. Well, Friday's show is here, and I do want to hit on some of those games. And the game that I want to start with, you already know what it is. It is obviously Kentucky, Missouri, as Kentucky looking for really its first marquee win of the season. I guess you could say Michigan is sort of a marquee win, but when Michigan's 7-4, they lost their starting point guard in the middle of the game. I don't know that you can call that that's not a win that you're going to write, you're going to be telling your grandkids about 50 years from now. But I bring it up because I do want to talk Kentucky, and I already kind of know what some of you are going to say. Two quick thoughts before we get into anything. One, a lot of you are going to be like, Torres, you always talk about Kentucky. Well, actually, I think I've talked about Kentucky less this year just because they haven't given me much to talk about. Now, we've talked about their marquee games. We've talked about Gonzaga and Michigan State and UCLA, but I feel like I've talked just as much Alabama on this show so far this season. I feel like I've talked just as much UCLA, just as much Arkansas, just as much UConn, just as much whatever. But beyond that, what I do not want to do on today's show is spend too much time already going over all of the stuff that I have already hit on, right? I have already done the John Calipari is out of excuses rant probably half a dozen to a dozen times on this show over the past 3 years. I know I did it a bunch during that 2021 COVID year where they could not win against anybody. I mean, they went 9-16, and that doesn't even tell half of the story of how bad that season was. But I did that rant a bunch that year. I did that rant after the St. Peter's game a season ago in the NCAA tournament. And I've done that rant probably twice this season already with Kentucky. Once after the Gonzaga game where they looked completely unprepared, did not show up ready to play. And I did after the UCLA game where with the loss, they fell to 4-13 versus ranked opponents. And so I'm not going to spend the next 10 minutes or 15 minutes or 30 minutes or 5 minutes talking about everything that's wrong with Kentucky and this needs to get fixed and that needs to get fixed. We've been there. We've done that. It's happened. Instead, what I want to do is I want to open it up to fans of Kentucky basketball, okay? Because rather than me yell and scream about how frustrating this is, how disappointing it is for a program with the resources, with the highest paid coach in college basketball, I'm just going to let you hear from the fans themselves on what they think of the current state of things as Kentucky loses again on Wednesday night to a team in Missouri that is really good, but is also coached by a first-year head coach in Dennis Gates, came from Cleveland State. And Dennis Gates, who I think is a heck of a coach, already has Missouri in better shape in 6 months on the job than John Calipari does over a decade plus at Kentucky. So I'm going to read the quotes and thoughts from Kentucky fans in a minute. But let me just, before I get to them, the only thought that I have on this game, and I do think it's important because I do think it's reflected in how a lot of Kentucky fans feel. Why I have no patience with John Calipari, right? By the way, Cal's been great to me. So this isn't like I don't like John Calipari, so let me throw dirt on his grave. No. But my job is to unbiasedly talk about college sports, and in this case, specifically college basketball, and he's simply not getting the job done. As I said a minute ago, highest paid coach in the sport. Despite what he tried to tell you this summer, he has every resource needed to have success at the highest level, and he has not done that since 2015. And so as we look into what's wrong with Kentucky, what I would just say, if I had one complaint, then we'll get to some of the listener reader emails. What I would say is this: I am blown away that we are now basically at about the 50% point of the season. We're really at about the 45 to 48%. We're not quite at 50%, but we're getting pretty close. And what blows me away, and where I would be frustrated if I was a Kentucky fan, we're now almost at the halfway point, and John Calipari has absolutely no idea what players play well together. The bottom line is, this is why you play an out-of-conference slate, so that by the start of conference play, you know what guys you can go to proverbial, not literal, because people get mad when you say it, but proverbial war with. That is the whole point about a conference play. What rotations, what works, what doesn't, who do you play with together? And so why I would be frustrated with Kentucky if I was a Kentucky fan is because Calipari clearly has no idea what players play well together, what rotations work, what don't. That is frustrating, and that is especially unacceptable for a couple reasons. One, they played a foreign tour. Like, they went overseas, They got extra practices, extra games in the preseason, so that's supposed to help them figure this out. 2, they have an experienced team. It shouldn't take you until February to figure out what pieces work together, when really about 5 to 6 of your most important pieces are guys who were in your program last year. Oscar Tshiebwe was in your program last year. Sahvir Wheeler was in your program last year. Jacob Toppin was in your program last year. It is unacceptable. And here's the third thing. It'd be one thing if you played this loaded, unbelievable out-of-conference slate, like what Alabama did when they went to the PK85, played UConn, Michigan State, North Carolina, then immediately came home and played Memphis, Gonzaga, and Houston. It'd be one thing if you played a schedule like North Carolina, which has already played at Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio State on a neutral court, PK85, all that good stuff. Or UConn, I should mention, by the way, PK85, they've played 3 conference games, whatever. Kentucky's played now 5 with the Missouri game. 5 conference games against power conference opponents, if you include Gonzaga. 1-4, and they've been losing by an average of 12 points. So that is why, like, the whole point of having a light out of conference slate is to get things figured out so you have it ready to go in league play. Only it's the opposite. Only Kentucky fans are frustrated. And so with that said, let's get to a couple responses from Kentucky fans, because I do think that their voices need to be heard today. I think rather than me yelling and screaming, I think, which I mean, I guess I already did, so whatever. But rather than me yelling and screaming more, I think it's just best to read a few notes that I got on this team after the game on Wednesday night. This one came from someone named Clay. I won't use his last name for obvious reasons. He said, I am a lifelong Kentucky fan, and right now the only emotion I have towards this team is general apathy. I feel like the last few seasons have followed the exact same script. Reliance on transfers who take time to round into form, coming from lower level programs, as well as freshmen who also take time to round into form, adjusting to speed and physicality of college ball. And by the time the team finally rounds into form around February every year, it's too late to make up for too much ground in salvaging a good tournament seed, and all while the other teams are getting better as well. When Kentucky had superior talent at every position, it wouldn't matter, but it seems like we have Oscar Tshiebwe, obviously, and a bunch of players who would be fine role players on past Kentucky teams. This isn't even getting to the fact that it seems like the modern game has passed Cal by, and he is either too prideful or doesn't think his current roster can play the way that 90% of teams are currently playing. The only person this falls back on is Cal. Maybe this upcoming recruiting class, I think everybody knows, #1 recruiting class in the country, gets him back to his old ways. But looking forward to next year isn't something Kentucky fans are accustomed to in December. So what I would say is, I think Clay's email basically sums up where most of the frustration is. The only thing I would argue, you can't really say that you dug yourself too big of a hole to get a good seed this year, or that every year that's what happens, when he did get a 2 seed last year. But other than that, what I see from Clay is what I see from a lot of Kentucky fans. I think, one, the word apathy is a word that I heard a lot on Wednesday night. I have a buddy who's a Kentucky fan, listener to this show. I won't say his name, but I shared his text on social media where he said, I'm done with this team. It's awful. Tell me what I need to know about UConn. I'm hopping on the bandwagon. I literally got that text from a buddy. And the point is, it's apathy. It's apathetic. It is going into games expecting the worst and then having that happen, which I'm going to get to in the next one. And then 2, it's about the fact that there's no reason. This is the part that I think trips me up. There's no real reason to think it's going to get better. Like, what have we seen this year that makes us think it's going to get better? What have we seen that makes it think it's going to get easier as you get deeper into conference play, where, oh, by the way, you have a game at Alabama and at Tennessee in the next few weeks? Second email I want to read. This one came from someone named Austin, came right after the game. He said, I have defended Cal for years being capitalized, but after tonight, I'm done, man. Not only did we lose to Mizzou by double digits, we lost to Mizzou with a first-year head coach by double digits. I have no interest in anything Calipari has to say outside of him saying, hey, we had a great run. I am not the guy anymore. It's time to step aside. That is the only statement from Calipari that will keep my attention on Kentucky basketball. We could literally beat Louisville by 90 next week, and I wouldn't give a bleep. That was from Austin, who is also a Kentucky fan. And so I think that's the other side of things too, is that what I just said? I don't know how it gets better even in this season. So those were a couple responses. Also had a few more that I couldn't share too many expletives, but I just want to bring it up because that is the state of Kentucky fans right now. They either don't care, are apathetic, or are so disappointed, or don't know what the answer is. I don't have an answer, and I'm tired of telling it. And so with that said, all I would say on the Kentucky game from Wednesday night is a few things. One, here are my final thoughts on the state of Kentucky basketball right now. Even if they turn things around, here's the thing. I think because of how the season has started, because they are going to exit out of conference play, they have one out-of-conference game left against Louisville, which is probably the worst Power 6 program in college basketball, maybe outside of Cal. Even if they beat Louisville, their out-of-conference resume is essentially Michigan. And so why I bring it up is because they're now getting to a point where even if they have a great season in the SEC, I do think the more losses that they take on, the harder that it's going to be to put themselves in position to have success. So even if they flip things around, even if John Calipari is listening to this segment and saying to himself, I got to get things figured out, and then he does, it becomes increasing. You're just so far behind the 8 ball in terms of setting yourself up for where you want to go that I think that's the part that people are misinterpreting. I still think this team will probably make the NCAA tournament. I don't think it's a guarantee. But at the end of the day, the goal of Kentucky isn't to make the NCAA tournament. It's to put yourself in position to win a lot of games there, potentially get to a Final Four, especially when you have the reigning National Player of the Year. And so the more losses you take, the farther you fall down the seed line to Clay's first point, and you're battling an uphill battle to put yourself in position to make a run once you get to the tournament. So that to me is the biggest concern. I think the second biggest concern is something Austin hit on, which was Kentucky signed the #1 recruiting class in high school basketball last year. And I think there were a lot of people that were excited about that. 4 of the top 10 players in America. I think increasingly more fans are not even excited about that because they feel like in their heart of hearts, how excited can I get? John Calipari's had every different team, every different excuse, every different this, every different that. All it results in is struggles on the court. So why is anything going to be different next year, even when we have the #1 recruiting class coming in? And I think 3, the only other thought that I really have on Kentucky, I think we're going to learn a lot about them, not in the Louisville game on Saturday. Their next SEC home game is next Tuesday night against LSU. And I bring it up because if Kentucky loses that game, that's the game that I have circled where I say if they lose that game, they might not be a tournament team. It sounds crazy for Kentucky fans. I don't know if you think it's crazy or not, but if you lose to LSU, LSU's probably a tournament team. If you can't beat tournament caliber teams on your home court, then it probably doesn't bode well for you having any level of success that it takes to get into the NCAA tournament, especially because the schedule is loaded this year in terms of the SEC. Over the next 2 weeks, Kentucky, within the first 2 weeks of the SEC regular season, will play at Alabama and at Tennessee. They play 2 games against Tennessee total. They have 2 games against Arkansas. They will play Auburn at Auburn. They will play Mississippi State at Mississippi State. Those are all NCAA tournament teams, most of those games on the road. And so that's my closing thought. I think LSU, to me, is the litmus test. If you lose that one, you're not going to – there's no reason to think you can win the games needed to make the NCAA tournament. Just something I'm thinking, but that's kind of my state of Kentucky basketball coming out of the Missouri game.